Hello, good afternoon. As many of you know, I'm Corinne Lloyd. I'm the Fellow for Development at Magdalene, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to another one of our online webinars. I'm really delighted that we're able to present a talk today by Dylan Gaffney. Dylan is currently working towards his PhD, and he's directing a field project in an archaeologically uncharted island group off the western coast of New Guinea. As I told him just a few minutes earlier, who knew there was an island group there? His work seeks to unlock the dynamics of how Stone Age seafarers dispersed from Southeast Asia to the Pacific as we moved out of Africa and into the new and challenging environments such as the equatorial rainforest and small islands for the first time. He is, however, going to speak a little bit more generally about his research, but I just thought that our listeners, viewers, would be interested in the focus of his PhD. Just to make you aware, there will be the opportunity for you to ask your questions. There will be a Q&A function. And when Dylan has finished with his talk, I very much would encourage you to ask your questions. And finally, I would like to use this opportunity to send my very grateful thanks to Emma and Sarah, the really stalwart little events team at Magdalene, who've been working very hard to put together this virtual events program for your enjoyment. And I'm delighted to say that hundreds of our members have joined us since we've all found ourselves in these somewhat discombobulating times of lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. So without no further ado, I will pass over to Dylan and thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. I will now share my screen. So, 2020 has been an interesting year for most of us, and it's taught us the meaning of insularity, or at least new meanings, and the effects that it can have on our outlook, behaviour, and social relationships. At times it has meant isolation, being cut off from the normal functioning of society. But insularity didn't always have these connotations. The first reference to it in the English language in 1611 is more, conveys a sense of the potential for connectivity, as well as a sense of community and belonging. Perhaps 2020 has also taught us reflection and resilience, and the value of our social relationships. And we can certainly empathise with those Ice Age islanders who, as we shall see in this talk, strove to maintain connectivity within and between their islands, generating possibilities for new connections, new ways of seeing the world, and new social forms, even if it meant undertaking daring and risky overseas crossings using only small rafts or boats. So islands can do interesting and sometimes very strange things to the organisms that live on them, including humans. So this can, in terms of humans, change our behaviour, sometimes even our physiology and anatomy, and our brains themselves. For social scientists and evolutionary scientists alike, islands present fascinating ways to examine the evolutionary constraints and opportunities afforded by these unique configurations of land. In fact, the diverse array of landforms, whether small or large, near shore or remote, present us with different ways to examine how these different environmental settings and these different environmental factors, different environments of place, so to speak, can affect the organisms that play out their lives upon them. And far from being simply continents on the micro scale, islands, especially smaller islands, are what we'd call liminal and littoral worlds. So that is to say that they are places in between. They are something entirely new at the interface of the sea and the land. So the word island itself in English comes from the Old English aig, which ultimately derives from a term to mean watery, and land, which is land, of course. So the meeting of the water and the land. So when humans first moved into these island worlds, these new environments, they modified the ecosystems through which they moved. And in turn, these ecosystems shaped these humans' behaviour and expanded what it meant to be human. No longer were humans confined to the Afro-Eurasian continental world, but they're also able to push out into a variety of new oceanic worlds, such as the Pacific Islands, African outliers, the Mediterranean, eventually the Indian Ocean, and remote Polynesia. So one thing that islands can do to biological systems is to shrink them. And this is known as the island rule. And one part of that rule is that animals can dwarf when they reach islands. So this happened, it would seem, throughout the history of vertebrate terrestrial life on the planet. Even in the age of the dinosaurs, there are instances of sauropods, which are known to be the largest land animals, are shrunk to the size of a small horse. More recent examples come from places like the Mediterranean. On the top right, you'll see a pygmy hippopotamus, which has been dwarfed upon reaching Cyprus. There are many instances of mammoths and stegodons and mastodons being dwarfed when they reach small islands. For instance, here you have a mammoth on Sicily that was dwarfed to the size of a large dog, or in the case of deer that are shrunk to the size of an owl. And this dwarfing, we now think, can happen quite quickly. So this recent case study suggests that cattle that were moved by humans onto Amsterdam Island in the southern Indian Ocean actually dwarfed in their size, their body size, by about 1/3 over the period of only about 100 years. So over deeper evolutionary time, over the period of tens of thousands or millions of years, we can see in the graph on the right that the body size of animals such as the mammoths or cervids, the deer, can really shrink quite substantially from their initial form. And the reverse was also possible and did happen, where small animals, in particular on the mainland, upon reaching islands, became much larger. And again, this happened in the Cretaceous during the period of the dinosaurs. So here you have a pterodactyl that is grown to be the size of a giraffe and became predatory, hunting small theropod dinosaurs. Or you have more recently the gorilla lemur on Madagascar, which overlapped in time with human occupation. You have the perhaps more well-known moa from New Zealand, which were hunted to extinction within the first few hundred years of Maori occupation. This image is a little bit inaccurate for two reasons. The first being that Maori didn't use bow and arrow to hunt, and the moa may have had a more forward-projecting neck. And we still have examples of these island giants. One example being the kakapo from New Zealand, which is the largest parrot in the world, now predominantly flightless. So it has grown to sort of inhabit or make the most of new niches provided by these new island worlds into which they colonized. So island gigantism wasn't necessarily linear, and it's what we might call allometric, which means that some parts of the organism grew or shrunk, while other aspects of that organism stayed the same. For instance, here, this recent study suggests that island birds actually have larger brains than their mainland counterparts. And these brains facilitate sometimes more novel behavioral innovations, such as tool use, for instance. In New Caledonia and Hawaii, crows that have migrated to those islands have begun to use tools in new ways. And this growth in brain size in particular can be particularly advantageous, especially for organisms that need to innovate to overcome adaptive challenges when they move into these different environments, these insular environments. And this is what we call behavioral flexibility. So the capacity to change established behaviors, and in social species, the capacity to then share or copy the most successful innovations so that it actually improves the adaptive success, the evolutionary success of the whole population. So often this will take the form of being flexible enough to innovate new subsistence behaviors, for instance, targeting new plants or animals in terms of expanding what is the usual behavior of food getting, and perhaps where those foods are no longer available on islands, to then experiment with getting new foods. And here you have two instances of tool using animals trying to get those foods. So like many great apes, humans are highly intelligent, and we're able to problem solve and project future actions and interpret the intentions of others in our group. But unlike many other extant apes, including sometimes chimps, we are highly flexible in our tasks. So the way our brains have come to be reorganized over the past 6 or 7 million years, since we split from our last common ancestor with the chimpanzees, allow us to change and innovate new routines, activities, and technologies, and to readily share these ideas through gesture, language, and most recently, writing. So it's been suggested that these capacities allowed us to increasingly settle novel and sometimes challenging environments, including island habitats, and as mentioned earlier, to expand what it means to be a human. But we don't yet have a very good handle on how rapidly early humans were able to change their behaviors, whether this happened over 1 generation or 100 generations, and if people innovated totally new behaviors upon reaching islands for the first time, or slightly tweaked old behaviors to gradually modify their behaviors through time. So what is the archaeological evidence for humans living on islands? So here you have a generalized family tree of the Homo genus. That's Homo being what I would define as humans, and then there are different species within that, evolving in Africa as Homo habilis, and then into Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, and later splitting into different species as they moved out of Africa. And this family tree is often under revision as new fossil evidence is discovered, as some fossil species are revised and split into 2 different species, or vice versa, as species are combined. So the evidence for island hominins, humans living on islands, comes relatively late. And you'll see this dotted blue line here at about 1 million years ago being that threshold. So the first evidence for island hominins potentially comes in the form of Homo erectus, and in particular the Homo erectus that moved out of Africa and expanded into Asia. So Southeast Asia, in particular island Southeast Asia, is becoming one of the most exciting places to do Ice Age archaeology and paleoanthropology, simply because of the rate of discoveries that are being made there that are totally redefining what we think of as within the realms of humans and what it means to be human, even what it means to be a Homo sapien and what the genus Homo means. So there's tentative evidence for sea crossings in Southeast Asia, possibly by Homo erectus or a related group. But we don't quite know if these crossings were accidental or deliberate. So we have some evidence, a lot more fossil evidence, in particular coming from Java, from sites like Trinil and Sangiran, for Homo erectus, the classic Java man. But beyond that, in the islands of Sulawesi, Flores, Luzon, in the Philippines, we have more tentative evidence, for instance, in the form of, on Luzon at the Kalinga site, rhinoceros, Pleistocene rhinoceros being butchered by some kind of hominin, but we don't have the fossil evidence for which hominin. The same on Sulawesi, stone tools being made and large animals being butchered, but we don't have the human fossil evidence to know which species. So at this time, Java was actually connected to the mainland due to slightly lower sea levels. So although we have good evidence for Homo erectus on Java, we don't quite know what was happening when they moved into the truly insular world of Sulawesi and Luzon. But we do know that these Homo erectus on Java were interacting with aquatic environments and possibly a myriad of environments, from woodlands to grasslands, possibly tropical forests. And here you have an example of a shell being engraved by Homo erectus, which we have fossil evidence for from the Dubois collection, originally collected in the early 20th century. So here Homo erectus has actually made engravings on a shell. And what this tells us about symbolism is a little bit difficult to assess, whether it's the same kind of symbolism that you or I might understand by making engravings, some kind of primitive art, or perhaps more likely a more primordial form of symbolism. And Homo erectus were also using these shells, as tools, as scraping tools. So here's evidence from the same shell assemblage to show that there were small fracture marks made on the shells as they were used for cutting. So did these interactions with aquatic resources and environments amongst Homo erectus populations in Java encourage a hydrophilic population, that is to say a population that is comfortable with water, as other extant great apes aren't? The chimpanzees and orangutans are usually relatively reluctant to paddle. They're not very good swimmers. So in this instance, we have limited information, but we can start to speculate whether Homo erectus were becoming more at home in aquatic environments. We also know that adaptations to the shoulder of Homo erectus, which would have been useful for them throwing things, also perhaps have implications for them paddling or swimming. There have been some attempts to reconstruct rafts, Paleolithic rafts. So here is a project led by Bednarik, and he attempted to construct a raft entirely from the materials available to Homo erectus at this time, using Paleolithic choppers, stone tools, as well as bamboo and other organic material. So this came in a series of 4 voyages with 4 different Paleolithic canoes. And he tried to demonstrate that Homo erectus could, with the available technology at the time, navigate from Java into the islands of Indonesia, and even from Indonesia into Australia. However, there are some conceptual limitations in this study, simply in the fact that it is a modern Homo sapien with a functioning modern brain using these tools to produce a large raft. What we really want to know is, could a Homo erectus with its own brain and its own cognitive limitations, could that start to, or have the imagination to produce a raft, even a much more simple raft, or any kind of flotation device to deliberately move into the islands? So much of the debate in this area still revolves around what archaeologists and paleoanthropologists presume to be the cognitive capacities of Homo erectus. And what we need is more fossil evidence from the area to really have a better idea of to what extent Homo erectus were able to move into islands deliberately, or perhaps accidentally washed through into the islands by inclement weather. So moving into the 21st century in terms of archaeological discoveries, a number of new hominin or human species have been discovered in the islands of Southeast Asia. And this comes in the form of Homo floresiensis on Flores in Indonesia, and Homo luzonensis in the island of Luzon in the Philippines. So floresiensis was initially discovered by New Zealander Mike Morwood and his Indonesian and Australian team, which really shocked the archaeological community, the scientific community more generally, finding a new species of hominin in an area where we thought was relatively absent of hominins. And the same for Homo luzonensis, discovered by Florent Dutoit, who was hosted here at Magdalene last year, and his team in collaboration with Philippines archaeologists and international collaborators. So the fossil evidence itself is sparse, but also enough. We have enough of the postcranial and the skull from these species to begin to reconstruct something of their stature. And from that, they have been given the nickname the hobbits, because they basically stood about a meter or so tall. So in this way, humans seem to follow the island rule, at least to an extent, where hominins can become dwarfed when they reach islands. In this instance, floresiensis, here you can see compared to the stature of a modern Homo sapien. But this species also lived alongside other animals that had been dwarfed. For instance, the stegodon, essentially a mammoth or an elephant that had been dwarfed upon reaching the island of Flores, while other animals, such as this giant stork on the left, a bird, grew to be the size of a modern human. Varanid monitor lizards, larger than Komodo dragons, grew to large sizes, as you can see reconstructed on the right. And also giant rats, which still inhabit the island today, grow to about the size of a cat. So this dwarfing also affected the brain of Homo floresiensis, and although there's been substantial debate about to what extent the brain has been dwarfed, and which species was the ultimate ancestor of Homo floresiensis, it is clear that floresiensis seems to be a new species with distinctive cranial and brain morphology. So the brain, based on these digital endocasts, seems to be about 430 cubic centimeters, and that's about the size of a chimpanzee. But the brain structure, although it was smaller, is much more like a Homo erectus, which we've seen previously. So it has derived or more modern frontal and temporal lobes, which likely facilitated higher cognitive processing, including initiative taking and future planning. Certainly the archaeological evidence for floresiensis attests to cooking practices and animal processing activities, such as butchery. However, despite this, there's very little evidence for behavioural flexibility. Although the hobbits may have established a successful population on Flores and Luzon for perhaps several 100,000 years even, no evidence for making use of abundant island resources like shellfish or fish is present in the archaeological evidence. So these species seem to have moved into islands and become dwarfed. Their anatomy has been changed, but their behaviour is relatively carried on the same as if they were on the mainland. And this reluctance to change their behaviours probably prevented them moving further east into the smaller islands of Indonesia and into the Pacific, where there were even more evolutionary constraints on human living in these islands, particularly with a lack of food in many islands and so on. So there's been a paradigm shift in this species, the Neanderthals, and we're moving closer to home or closer back to Europe now, away from Southeast Asia. So these have been termed smart Neanderthals by Clive Findlass in his recent book. And we're really totally revising how we understand this species in the context of their cognitive abilities and those abilities relative to our own as Homo sapiens. So there's recently been evidence for Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals using pigments. So here you have a reconstruction of the man with ochre and charcoal use for decoration. There's evidence for them producing cave paintings in Europe. They were building houses. They were making complex stone tools. They were making composite technologies by combining two different types of material together. They even intermarried with our own species, Homo sapiens. And in the way that our ancestors are Homo sapiens, they're also, for almost all of us, Neanderthals as well. So we are the descendants of Neanderthals. So this raises important questions, such as, were they able to move into islands just as Homo sapiens have been able to? And there is some evidence to suggest that they were able to. And this comes from the Mediterranean, particularly the islands of the Aegean. So here is a plot showing the different sites. Tentative sites are opened presented as open circles, while more secure archaeological evidence, dated archaeological evidence, is in the form of closed circles. So the most strong evidence comes from sites on Crete, which we'll explore further. So, whether it was possible to move into the islands of the Mediterranean by Neanderthals, it would imply a cognitive leap of sorts from these hominins moving into Europe and not only just looking onto the Mediterranean basin and seeing islands in the distance, but also making the decision to actually recruit others within the group and organize themselves in such a way that they built a raft and then traversed the Aegean to get to islands like Crete and some of the smaller Cycladic islands. They did have the components of the technology to do this, to make rafts. So recently has been discovered a string from France in the context of a Neanderthal site. So Neanderthals were making 3-ply string. They were also using adhesive technologies such as tars, natural tars, to adjoin stone tools to their spears. So all of these components could be, of course, used to produce something like a simple raft and then to travel from Greece into the Mediterranean islands. But the evidence on the Greek islands themselves is relatively scant and doesn't really provide for much ability to say what these Neanderthals were doing when they reached these islands. So there is evidence to suggest that they were using local raw materials, local stone tools, producing stone tools on the islands when they got there. But whether they changed their behaviours to adapt to these small islands when they arrived to them, or whether they were simply frequenting them occasionally or seasonally to hunt and then to return to the mainland, we simply don't have the evidence. So we still need more archaeological evidence. And a few research teams working in Greece are aiming to resolve this. So there is evidence, not from the archaeology, but from the genetics, that another similar species to Neanderthals, the Denisovans, were crossing water barriers. And this comes from modern DNA evidence collected by people like Murray Cox in New Zealand or Guy Jacobs in the Department of Archaeology here in Cambridge. So we now know that Denisovans and Neanderthals were interbreeding with each other and with modern humans, or with Homo sapiens. And most populations of modern day Homo sapiens carry with them some aspect of Neanderthal DNA. In particular, East Asian and New Guinean or Melanesian populations carry with them Denisovan DNA. And it seems from the DNA evidence that these Denisovans did make it into places like New Guinea, crossing through the islands of Indonesia into New Guinea from Asia. But we simply don't have the archaeological evidence or the fossil evidence to support it. So this is one of the reasons why Southeast Asia and near Oceania, the Pacific, is becoming an incredibly exciting area for this kind of research, for archaeological and paleoanthropological research. So although previous work has been primarily focused on the cradle of humankind in Africa, how we evolved in Africa, we don't really know much about how humans continue to evolve and admix as they left Africa, and how these different populations then gave rise to much of the diversity in human populations that we see around the globe today. So, moving into new frontiers, Homo sapiens, our own species, then from about 60 or 70,000 years ago began to truly expand more rapidly and readily into insular environments, moving from Eurasia into the Philippines, into Indonesia, eventually reaching even the former supercontinent of Sahel, which attached New Guinea to Australia and Tasmania when the sea levels were lowered during the ice ages. They moved into the Ryukyu Islands and into Japan. They crossed into the Americas, possibly most of them following a land bridge, while other aspects or other populations may have followed a coastal corridor, possibly even crossing between some islands, and then moving into the Californian Channel Islands about 11,000 years ago. So these numbers on the screen here present you with the thousands of years ago that each island was colonized by Homo sapiens, our own species. In the Mediterranean, a little bit later, possibly moving into Sicily 30,000 years ago, into Cyprus 15,000 years ago, and into Madagascar possibly about 10,000 years ago. So these modern humans began to break a range of records in terms of island colonization and island living and seafaring technologies between this period. So they moved into a multitude of new insular environments, as I've just mentioned. And this included even very small islands, which were previously out of reach of other hominins, simply because they were so challenging to live on, because of lack of food and other resources. So these Homo sapiens were able to, whether quickly or gradually, change their behaviors to adapt to these environmental factors. So they moved out of sight of land itself, a major shift. So they hominins in New Guinea sailed beyond sight of land into basically open water to reach islands like Manus. So they're not only rafting to specks of land that they see on the horizon, but also imagining what lies beyond the horizon and taking the risk to voyage beyond that horizon to discover what lay there. So there's also good evidence that unlike other species, Homo sapiens maintained connections between islands when they were colonizing them, so which formed a support base, a social network that they could then use or tap into to support their populations. And this prevented the same kind of island dwarfing that we saw in Homo floresiensis, at least in the most part. And there's evidence for this in forms of obsidian stone tool exchange between island groups from a very early period. So here you see the Ice Age sites that we have on record for the Southeast Asian and Pacific region. And these are, as you can see, there are many, many more of them compared to the previous hominid sites. So it seems that humans have been able to expand more readily into these environments. And this is what has been called a seafaring nursery, this area of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, in which Homo sapiens were able to really develop and refine their seafaring skills as they crossed into islands and between islands for the first time. So the earliest sites marked in red on this map are characterized by what we might think of as more modern thinking styles. For instance, the same that we see in Homo sapiens that colonized Europe slightly later at about 40 to 50,000 years ago. So this comes in the form of cave paintings, complex plant processing, and a broad array of dietary changes and specialized technologies used to capture these animals in particular. But what we don't know is how and when people moved through these islands. So there have been two models traditionally put forward for how Homo sapiens moved dispersed throughout the islands of Indonesia, the earliest Homo sapiens seafarers. And predominantly the evidence has supported a southerly route through Java, Flores, and into Australia. And this has been supported by computer modelling, as you see in the top right, as well as archaeological evidence. However, there's very little evidence for humans moving along this northern route along the equator, through the tropical forests of Borneo, Sulawesi, and eventually reaching New Guinea. So this is what my PhD, just to touch upon this towards the end of the presentation, is aiming to resolve. Were hominins moving, or were Homo sapiens moving through this equatorial route as they dispersed into the islands of northeast Indonesia and New Guinea? And when were they doing this? Was it as early as Australia, which seemed to have been colonized about 60 or 70,000 years ago? Or was it only much later that humans dispersed into these islands? And what do these different routes tell us about adaptive changes in these different populations? Moving along the southern route through Java and Flores had a much more open environment and presented humans with different animals to catch different plant resources, whereas those moving along the equator through the tropical forests were again presented with different ecologies to adapt to. So here you'll see in red the Raja Ampat Islands, which Corinne mentioned at the beginning, is where I'm working, the archaeologically uncharted island group off the northwest coast of New Guinea. And this is turning out to be, well, essentially the earliest small island occupied by Homo sapiens globally. And so in this island group, we've now established a project with Indonesian collaborators and those working in West Papua. And we've surveyed, discovering over 150 archaeological sites. And we've excavated 3 of these sites to try to locate early evidence for human occupation on this island. So here on the left, you'll see that this is Waigeo Island, one of the major islands in the Raja Ampat group. And you also have modelled there using bathymetric modelling the coastline as it was in the ice ages. So at one point it was perhaps twice as big as it is now, and the large inland lake that splits Waigeo in two today probably in the past was a large valley system supporting a river flowing through it. So, and at these sites we've been coming across things such as stone tools scattered on the surface, as well as cave paintings, some similar to that which has been found in Sulawesi dating to 50,000 years ago, so very, very early. And on Sulawesi it is the oldest figurative cave art known globally. So this area, in terms of its rock art evidence as well as its subsurface archaeological evidence, is proving to be very interesting. So here's an example of one of the environments that I've been working in, and this is one of the cave sites. So you can see highlighted here, it's very hard to see through the tropical forest, but that's the entrance to the cave, in which we've been digging a number of trenches and excavation units, very carefully going down a few centimeters at a time, recording each artifact or fossil as we come across it, mapping it in 3D, so that we can then explore the relationships, the stratigraphic relationships between these materials and the dates that we then obtain through radiocarbon dating to see exactly how old certain artifacts are, how old certain fossils are. So, and these excavations can go relatively deep, sometimes several meters deep into the ground before you hit the bedrock. So here again is one of the cave sites, and here we have Moses, one of the Raja Ampat field assistants, sieving through ancient shell remains, which were essentially part of people's diet. About here, this is only about 3,000 years, and much later in time, you get through to a transition from people using shellfish to people also using the tropical forest resources, such as marsupial fauna, forest fauna. And from these sites, we also have evidence for complex plant processing in the form of resin being used for burning and lighting the way through cave systems, plus uses adhesive, the hunting of small and difficult to catch agile species such as giant fruit bats, which necessitated innovating specialist equipment like bone tools. Later in time, we even have the evidence for translocation of some marsupial mammal species such as wallabies from the island of New Guinea into the Raja Ampat Islands, into Waigeo Island. So these populations were actively managing and in fact terraforming their island worlds so that it suited them better, so they had a reliable species which they could then hunt for protein. So that's just a little bit of a summary of my work in the Raja Ampat Islands, and the aims to refine what we know about the direction and timing of human dispersals through Indonesia, and in particular on this island, which we now know to be the earliest evidence for Homo sapiens settlement on small insular islands, to see how people's behaviours changed and how rapidly or gradually and to what extent these behaviours were changed over the millennia. And we're just starting to refine these or answer these questions through our archaeological laboratory work, which I've had a lot of time to focus on over the previous few months of lockdown. So just to summarize, islands present fascinating opportunities to study how human brains and behavior can be transformed through time under specific conditions. But islands are also becoming increasingly symbols for the anthropogenic effects on the planet. Archaeologists know that humans have been altering the planet in sometimes quite substantial ways over the past tens of thousands of years, and especially over the past few thousand years. As sea levels rise in the coming century, we will unfortunately be presented with opportunities to examine how humans respond either rapidly or gradually to these environmental changes, including the drowning of some islands, as well as the creation of new islands in real time. By studying how human behavior has evolved in response to these changing insular environments in the past, it may be a guide for how humans are able to behaviorally respond or change their behaviors in the coming centuries. So I'll end it there with some acknowledgements to my collaborators in Indonesia, Raja Ampat and internationally, as well as those at Magdalene and those in the Department of Archaeology. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for what was a really fascinating talk. And I think you're absolutely right, particularly the time we live in now, that the more we know of what motivated those who came before us, we may be able to find more answers for those that follow us. In the interest of time, I would like to group together some of the questions that we received. We've had a number of questions. I hope you will be delighted to hear that, Dylan, and that clearly shows how fascinated your listeners have been. So we've had a couple of questions that were focused on whether there was a critical size of island that drives dwarfism or gigantism, and also along the similar lines, you know, why did some animals become giants whilst others became dwarfs?
Yeah. So, I mean, the island rule stipulates that small animals or small organisms will become bigger on islands. And this is essentially because in islands there are fewer competitors. So these small animals can really expand and occupy niches that they previously hadn't. While in reverse, the large animals, usually large animals on mainlands, then become much smaller. And this is because of the energetic constraints of living on islands. If it's difficult to obtain the same amount of food, then it becomes adaptively, or it becomes maladaptive to maintain a big body size, and especially in some instances a big brain size, which takes up a lot of energy. So this is one of the reasons why large animals then reduced in their size. So they're almost coming to meet each other in this intermediate range. And in terms of the size of islands that have effects on gigantism or dwarfing, there has been research both in the fossil record and in present day biological systems, which suggest that, for instance, in the mammoths that were dwarfed on small islands, it seems to be the size of the island that has an effect. So smaller islands will more substantially dwarf mammoths, whereas the remoteness of that island seems to have less of an effect. The distance from the mainland seems to have less of an effect compared to the size. So a smaller island should produce a stronger dwarfing effect, simply because those smaller islands support less species, which affects the overall sort of system in which those animals can then find new niches or be constrained in their niche.
Thank you, Dylan. We've then had a number of questions really flowing around. Whether you have found evidence that there has been a gene flow between Homo sapiens and other Homo species apart from Neanderthals. And the other area that has been of interest to people is, why would humans choose to leave the mainland, to take on a dangerous journey across the sea, to live in much less hospitable environments? And then why didn't they move on from those much less hospitable environments?
Okay, so the first question is based on the genetics, which I certainly don't work on. I am a traditional field archaeologist who goes into the field and digs sites. However, the modern genetics, which is taken from modern populations and then analyzed, or sometimes from the fossil evidence, they can extract ancient DNA from these samples, suggests that not only were Denisovans and Neanderthals admixing and interbreeding, but there are also these ghost lineages, what's been called ghost lineages, or super archaics, who seem to have admixed with early Homo sapiens as well as Denisovans and Neanderthals. And in particular in New Guinea, it's very interesting. I've worked a lot in Papua New Guinea and now in West Papua, where there seems to be evidence from the genetics that there weren't just Denisovans who were admixing with Homo sapiens, but there is another species that we don't even have a name for or don't have fossil evidence for, so is yet to be assigned to a species. So for now they are called these ghost lineages. And the next questions were about,
Sorry, the next question was, why would people travel from the mainland to much less hospitable environments? And then once they've discovered that they've really ended up in places that were not as good as where they came from, why would they stay?
Yeah. So the next one is basically an ecological question, isn't it? And a question about what motivates humans. So in the instance of the Mediterranean, it could be that the island dwarfs, in the sense of mammoths and small deer that had become dwarf and had become more docile from living on islands, may have actually attracted hunters because they were easier to catch. So seasonally, some hunters may have crossed the seas into Crete and Sicily and so on, simply because these animals were easier and less risky to catch. In the context of Southeast Asia, one reason might be that populations of Homo sapiens were adapting themselves to be focused on the coastal region. So because a lot of Southeast Asia at the time was either tropical grassland or in particular tropical forest, which can be quite dense, some populations may have started adapting to the coast, started experimenting with boats, started pushing out further to sea. We need to look at this as a really gradual process over tens of generations, over millennia, where people became more at home with living around the coast. And from there, it's a more natural step to then see people exploring other islands, simply because humans are very creative and curious animals. And some of these islands did present new opportunities for resources, abundant shellfish, abundant fish. I mean, parts of Indonesia, the Raja Ampat Islands where I work, is actually the most marine eco-diverse place on the planet. So although there was reduced terrestrial diversity in terms of those resources attracting humans, the marine resources may have actually attracted humans.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Now, I know we have just 2 minutes left, but there have been about 3 questions coming in, specifically around the communities that you work in, you know, how you chose the Raja Ampat for your research, and how you get the permissions needed, and indeed how you find the sites, because of course we saw on your slide it was incredibly difficult to see the entrance to the cave through the jungle. So can you, just as your final answer for this afternoon, just perhaps comment a little bit on those particular areas of thought some of our guests have asked about?
Yep, certainly. So in terms of choosing the islands, that comes from having worked in Papua New Guinea, on the other side of the island of New Guinea, and starting to ask questions like, yes, when did the first human settlers move into New Guinea? And the obvious place to look for this is at the end of this island chain of Indonesia, right at the interface of Asia and the Pacific, as people moved through these islands, and in particular Waigia Island, where it looks like it was the last stepping stone. So if we look at the geology and the geomorphology of the region, we can reconstruct that it was the last stepping stone island as people moved from Asia into Australasia. So that was why I chose the Raja Ampat Islands. It is a challenge to get permission to work in Indonesia sometimes, but it is it's always a collaborative endeavour. So it's always involving local researchers at local universities, at the regional archaeology office. So we go through quite a thorough vetting in terms of getting research permits, getting research visas. But then when we're on the ground, we can start working and really invest our time in the project at hand. And to find the sites themselves, it is an incredible challenge under the rainforest, essentially, to find sites. And this is one of the reasons that we don't have much evidence from these tropical sites, is because it's very hard to come across anything that looks like an archaeological site unless it's a cave system, and that's why we've chosen to focus on the cave systems, because when you find a large cave, you can bet that humans in the past, perhaps going back 50,000 years or more, were also using that cave to sleep in, to use as habitation, shelter, for hunting sometimes, and so on.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was really very fascinating, and I know that all of those people out there that we unfortunately cannot see will have very much enjoyed this insight that you've offered into your area of research, and we very much look forward to hearing more in the years to come.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our listeners, viewers, guests. I really don't know how to refer to you, hence I've used all manner of adjectives. But thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next virtual Magdalene event. Bye-bye.